Hello and welcome to Real Obscure. My name is Kevin H. Shaw, and in this episode we'll experience a fantastical but somewhat forgotten fright fest that not only spawned a multi-movie franchise, but also introduced us to two of the greatest icons of 70s horror. From 1979, it's the surreal shocker, Phantasm. Phantasm was written, directed, shot and edited by Don Coscarelli. At a young age, Coscarelli began making his own short movies, and by the age of 19 he'd completed his first feature-length movie, Jim, the World's Greatest, which was picked up by Universal Pictures in 1976. The movie featured performances by Reggie Bannister and Rory Guy, later known as Angus Scrimm, both of whom Coscarelli would cast again in this movie. His follow-up, Kenny and Company, also featured Bannister and co-starred A. Michael Baldwin. That's the initial A, not one specific Michael Baldwin, even though, well, actually it is, but anyway. Baldwin would also go on to work with Coscarelli on Phantasm. Coscarelli said he became interested in making a horror movie when he saw the audience's reaction to the jump scares in the Halloween-themed Kenny and Company and the emotion it evoked in the viewer. He also felt the themes of the coming-of-age story featured in Kenny and Company could be something that would speak to audiences, and so would be the main story focus of his upcoming horror movie. That movie was an adaptation of Ray Bradbury's classic Something Wicked This Way Comes. Or would have been, had Disney not snapped up the rights the same week Coscarelli was about to approach Bradbury to discuss adapting it. Sadly, the Disney version suffered from studio interference that, well, whilst not completely ruining the movie, means it doesn't quite stick the landing, and it certainly would have been interesting to see Coscarelli's take on the material. One day I'll get round to doing an episode on Something Wicked This Way Comes, as even with the rewrites and studio edicts, it's still a really enjoyable movie. Maybe I'll stick that in the bag for Halloween 2026. Anyway, Coscarelli went back to the drawing board, and remembering a dream he'd had as a youth, which we'll explore later, he started working on the movie that would become Phantasm. Shooting with family and friends, with his mother for example appearing in the credits under at least 2 pseudonyms, filming took place over the course of over a year. Tallman actor Angus Scrimm recalled at one point he went 40 days without being on the set, and the movie was still being written during the shoot, so it wasn't uncommon for the cast to receive a call to film scenes literally with an hour's notice. The final cut was released on March 28, 1979, and it went on to become a box office smash, grossing over $22 million worldwide, on a budget of around $300,000. It spawned a franchise consisting of 5 movies to date, and between sequels Coscarelli also directed The Beastmaster, which also spawned a series of sequels and a TV show, the Bruce Campbell comedy horror Bubba Hotep, and in 2012 the adaptation of the cult novel John Dies at the End. Now, one thing I want to note here is just how good the score is on this movie. We're going to be going off onto all the details about who did what and all of that stuff, but I just want to give a shout out to Malcolm Seagrove and Fred Myrow. Seagrove's only major credit was his score for Phantasm, but Myrow had previously worked with Coscarelli on his 2 earlier movies, Jim, the World's Greatest and Kenny and Company, as well as providing the soundtrack for the sci-fi classic Soylent Green. The score is a fantastic mix of eerie, discordant notes and a cyclic, repeating theme that evokes memories of tubular bells and various Yali themes. It also reminds me a lot of the theme to John Carpenter's The Fog, which came out a year later. Like the rest of the movie, the lack of budget did play a part in the final score, which veers from the aforementioned electronic tonal sweeps to the almost childlike repetitive chiming theme, but if you listen closely you will notice the same piece as being recycled. But it's such a great, creepy and evocative score that you really won't mind at all. So anyway, what's it all about? Well, Phantasm is one of those movies that's better watched than explained. It's surreal, at times dreamlike, with a deliberately disjointed narrative and many scenes that don't exactly make sense, on a conscious level at least. Essentially, it's the story of two friends, Jodie Pearson, played by Bill Thornbury, and Reggie, played by Reggie Bannister, and Jodie's kid brother Mike, Michael Baldwin. Orphaned when their parents died, Jodie has been taking care of Mike but longs to shake off the old town and get back on the road. But soon he discovers that there is something sinister lurking on the edges of the night, a strange figure they name the Tall Man, who seems to have his own agenda and won't let anybody get in his way. The movie opens with a couple making love in the Morningside graveyard. The female partner, who's called the Lady in Lavender, was played by Kathy Lester and Laura Mann, with the second providing a body double for the nude scenes Lester was uncomfortable shooting. Her partner, we later discover, is a friend of Jodie and Reggie's named Tommy, played by Bill Cole. A fan of Coscarelli's work, Cole apparently asked to appear in the movie on the understanding that he would be killed off on screen, and yes, that's what happens, with the Lady in Lavender stabbing Tommy and then revealing that she is in fact the movie's main antagonist, the Tall Man. Immediately it's a strange nightmare scene, veering from the sensuality of the lovers to murder, and then the revelation that the Lady in Lavender is an aspect of the Tall Man. This is the opening scene, and it's offered without any kind of commentary or clues as to what is going on, and that's something you will experience a lot watching this movie, in a good way, and it just sets the tone, telling us that not everything we see is to be trusted. We cut to Tommy's funeral and we're introduced to our leads, Jodie and Reggie. Like most of the Phantasm cast, both Thornbury and Bannister had limited acting experience at the time of filming, and to this day their roles in the Phantasm franchise are probably their most well-known credits. Both are also accomplished musicians, which we will see in a jam session later, with Thornbury teaching music and Bannister being a successful folk musician. Bannister was also a lifelong friend of Coscarelli's, and the relationship between Jodie and Reggie was modelled after that of the director and Bannister. So we learn that the two believe that Tommy's death was a suicide, but as they discover later, things are much, much stranger than they could ever imagine. And it's at this point we also meet Mike, Jodie's 13-year-old brother, played by Michael Baldwin, a young actor who, as we mentioned previously, worked with Coscarelli on Kenny and Company. As a child he appeared in a few TV shows, including The Fantastic Journey and Starsky and Hutch, but is also most closely associated with the Phantasm movies, appearing in 3 of the 4 sequels, due to the role of Mike in Part 2 being played by James LeGros at the insistence of Universal. But that's a story for another time. Anyway, long story short, Mike becomes obsessed with the Tall Man, having spied on him at the graveyard, seeing him walking around town, and then even having nightmares about him later. Now I can understand this because for me the Tall Man is one of the most absolutely iconic villains of horror cinema. Coscarelli fitted the 6'3" Scrimm with lifts in his shoes, and put him in a suit that was too small, which resulted in him having this incredible, skinny, tall appearance that I'm sure was probably an influence on Slender Man. Apparently in real life Angus Scrimm was a lovely man, but his Tall Man is a creature of absolute menace and malice. His hawk-like features, piercing eyes, and swept-back long hair give him a fantastically predatory look, and his physical performance is superb, with his unrelenting stalking walk and vicious run. Yes, he can be quite quick on his feet when he needs to be, and the constant scowling. The tall man is also verbose and menacing without descending into quips or silly puns. He absolutely dominates the screen, even when he's simply standing motionless, and his now famous line of "boy" is sure to generate a shiver. Anyway, both Jodie and Mike attempt to learn more about the goings-on at the Morningside Mausoleum, and during their investigations, we're introduced to some other elements of the Phantasm mythology. First up, the absolutely iconic spheres. The idea for the spheres came from the dream I mentioned earlier, in which Coscarelli imagined he was being pursued by a number of chrome balls that were trying to impale him with a long needle. Is that Freudian? I don't know. This vision was brought into being by a craftsman named Willard Green, who sadly passed away shortly after filming was completed, and so he never saw his creations on the big screen, which is such a shame as they look amazing. Their design is so perfect, a simple silver ball that flies at speed and hunts down its prey, producing spikes and blades to kill whomever it pursues. It doesn't have human features, it's not a guy in a suit, and is so alien and inhuman that it's just absolutely terrifying to witness. They're unstoppable, unrelenting, deadly, fantastic. Now, the flying effects were achieved in a brilliantly creative low-budget fashion, with them being simply thrown into shot. However, Coscarelli rather smartly came up with the idea of reversing the footage, which gives their movements a slightly more unearthly look due to the way they actually speed up as they fly, rather than slow down, and it gives them a real sense of having volition and the ability to move in a way we don't understand. I do wonder though if anybody was actually struck by one of these flying metal balls, as I imagine that would be quite painful. At this point we're also introduced to the tall man's dwarves, diminutive figures in hooded robes who, yes, look just like the Jawas from Star Wars. But this was actually a complete coincidence. Coscarelli had already shot multiple scenes featuring these undead creatures before the release of Star Wars, and although he did consider reshooting these sequences to avoid suggestions of plagiarism, in the end he realised he'd simply shot too many scenes with them. Although not quite as iconic as the Tall Man and the Spheres, the dwarves do appear in multiple entries in the series, and there's a particularly striking scene of them on the Tall Man's homeworld. Yes, spoilers, he's an alien or extra-dimensional entity or something, but it reminds me somewhat of the robed worshippers we featured in last week's movie, Equinox. Anyway, we'll learn more about these strange minions in a moment, because that's about as far as I'm going to take the synopsis, because at this point it's very difficult to discuss the movie's plot and themes without giving it all away. So we're going to go straight into the spoiler zone. So Jodie, Mike and Reggie discover that the tall man has been exhuming corpses from the mausoleum and transforming them into dwarves, a revelation they discover when they encounter the shrunken version of their friend Tommy. Mike, Jodie and Reggie attempt to defeat the tall man in a variety of ways, but he is always able to thwart them, and when Reggie is killed by the lady in lavender, Jodie and Mike formulate a plan to defeat the tall man once and for all. Mike lures the tall man to an abandoned mine outside of town, and as he gives chase we have a wonderful surreal sequence with the tall man monologuing over the visuals as Mike encounters a series of terrifying visions. He is able to overcome his fears and leads him to a covered shaft entrance. Mike leaps over it, but the tall man falls into their trap. Jodie rolls a number of rocks and boulders into the shaft, capping it and burying the tall man forever. Jody raises his hands in victory. The brothers have succeeded in defeating the tall man. Or maybe not, because we then cut to Mike waking in his bed, and in a voiceover he talks about how he hears sounds from within and that the rocks won't hold him forever. He's talking to Reggie, who it turns out is not dead, and they sit before the fireplace in Mike's home. Reggie comforts Mike, saying the whole thing was just a nightmare and that he's hardly slept since the funeral last week. Mike, dazed, discusses how the tall man took his mom and his dad and then Jody, to which Reggie replies that it wasn't that tall man of yours who took him, but rather that Jody died in a car accident. We then see Mike's memory of standing before Jody's gravestone. Reggie comforts him, saying he'll take care of him before adding, "I know I can never take Jody's place, but I'm sure as hell gonna try." He says they need a change of scenery and suggests a road trip, telling Mike to go upstairs and pack. Mike enters his bedroom and finds a photo of Jody, which he spends a moment looking at, and then he swings his closet door shut. A mirror mounted on the door reveals the form of the tall man standing in his room. Mike turns to face him, but before he can react any further, the tall man reaches through the mirror, shattering it and pulling him into darkness. Now, this revelation that everything has been a dream, or, well, a nightmare, completely recontextualizes the movie. Now we understand why the narrative feels so disjointed at times, and why there is this weird dream logic to everything. Yes, Coscarelli was rewriting the movie as it was being filmed, and many of his changes were incorporated into the final edit, despite sometimes not exactly fitting in with the narrative elements he'd previously filmed. But it strangely works. The entire movie is about Mike dealing with his loss and his fears. The tall man embodies death itself, an unstoppable terror that has the power to take away those he loves. The lady in lavender, it could be argued, could also represent his sexual awakening, with her also being an aspect of the tall man due to his fears and worries about these confusing feelings he's experiencing. Reggie dies in the dream because Mike sees him now as a surrogate for Jody, and having already lost one brother, then his worst nightmare scenario would be to lose another. Even the dwarves, where those who have passed have transformed into something beyond our understanding or ability to connect with, shows how he is processing the loss of his family. This dream framing also explains some of the more unusual scenes we experience earlier in the movie. Mike's constant following of Jody and his desire just to hang out with a brother who seems at times oblivious to his presence. His worries about abandonment and Jody leaving. There's a genuinely saddening scene where Mike overhears Jody discussing leaving town with one of his friends. Jody continues to speak in the voiceover, and we see him riding away on a bicycle as Mike gives chase, and then watches him ride away, oblivious to his presence. And then there's the scene with Jody and Reggie sitting on the porch and jamming out with their guitars. Initially it just seems like a bit of a weird tangent, or an excuse to showcase the musical talents of Thornbury and Bannister, but it's actually relevant to the story. It's a positive memory, with Mike recalling his brother in better times. The entire thing is set up as one last hurrah for the brothers, an adventure in which the kid brother and his older, cool brother drive around in an awesome muscle car, shooting bad guys and defeating death itself, as represented by the tall man. But in reality, it's all just Mike's fantasy, and also apparently the basis for the TV show Supernatural. Coscarelli did go on to make 4 additional sequels, and although they're enjoyable, they lack the nightmare qualities of the original. We discover in these sequels that the tall man and his cohorts are in fact real, with Mike and Reggie battling him as he plunges the world into chaos. Jody also returns as a ghost trapped in a sphere, which somewhat lessens the impact of his loss in the first movie. And we also learn more of the tall man's origins, which, if I'm being honest, kind of weakens the character. I like the idea of things being left unexplained, as it gives you space to project your ideas and fears into. But in this case, I think it was a bad idea to fill in so much detail. Reggie also grows in some ways, becoming a badass fighter, but also becomes a little more of a comedic character, with his perpetual horniness being a running joke. Now, in a horribly ironic twist, the fifth movie sees Reggie battling to keep his grip on reality when he develops Alzheimer's disease, something which sadly Reggie Bannister is now currently suffering in real life. I know from personal experience what a horrible affliction this is, so if you'd like to show your support for Reggie, you can send your letters and best wishes to Reggie Bannister, PO Box 4387, Crestline, California 92325. On a positive note, the sequels do still have some great imagery and some fantastic set pieces, and Coscarelli's use of unused footage that was shot during the production of Part 1 is inspired at times. The movies see the young Mike manifesting in adult Mike's dreams and returning to his childhood battles with the Tall Man, for example, with an unused alternative ending from Part 1 being used in one of the later entries. Now personally, I would advise watching Part 1 itself and taking a break to allow it to really settle in your mind before watching any of the sequels. I think it works better as a standalone movie, and as much as we enjoy revisiting this world, I do think sometimes it's better to simply let some things just stand on their own. So if you're a fan of movies where nightmare logic is the disorder of the day, where themes are explored in a way that's both resonant but not too heavy-handed, and enjoy creative and unique scares, all wrapped up with heart and characters you genuinely care about, then do yourself a favour and hunt down Phantasm. You won't be disappointed. But please, if you do watch it, don't have nightmares. Boy! And on that note, thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of Real Obscure. This episode of Real Obscure was written, recorded, produced, and embalmed by me, Kevin H. Shaw. If you enjoy what I'm doing, then please like, share, comment, subscribe, and follow. You can also leave us a review on your chosen podcasting platform, as that really helps the show grow. Don't forget to visit realobscurepod.com, and you can also get in touch by emailing hellorealobscure@gmail.com. Our theme tune, Fu Manfred und Siggy, was created using Udio, as was our background theme, The Monster Dog. Phantasm is copyright 1979. All content here is used for educational and commentary purposes under Section 107 of the Copyright Act, Fair Use, and remains the property of the respective copyright holders. Presented here for the purposes of critique, commentary, and discussion. No copyright infringement is intended. So please, don't transform me into an extra-dimensional space dwarf.